Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you are new. Today I am going to be doing my January wrap up and sharing with you all of the books that I read in January and what I thought of them. So without further ado, let's just jump into the 5 books that I read in January. The first one we have here is I Would Leave Me If I Could, a collection of poetry by Halsey. I cannot believe I started 2021 with a poetry book. After I kept saying I was done with poetry because I didn't really like it, and then here I go and I start my year off with a poetry collection. But I'm actually so glad that I did, because besides that one Tim Burton book that I talked a lot about on my channel last year, this is probably my favorite poetry collection. I actually really liked so many of the poems in here. This was definitely the easiest one for me to read, which I don't know what that really says about the actual poetry. Like, I can't really review poetry because I don't fully understand it, so I can't review whether it's like good poetry or not, but I know that I liked it and I related to a lot of the stuff. I've heard that this is considered very angsty, so that could be why I related to it so much, but I just really enjoyed it and I'm considering buying a copy of this for my own collection. So I do have to give trigger warnings for sexual assault, possibly rape, I can't remember. Yeah, I think so. Miscarriage, and I think also drug and or alcohol abuse, so just be aware before picking up this book, but I really liked it and I would totally recommend it. Next up we have Instant Karma by Marissa Meyer. This is a young adult contemporary romance book, although I would consider it to be mostly contemporary. I think the romance was a little bit lacking, or just not really a super prominent part of the story for it to be considered like a true romance book, so I would consider it to be young adult contemporary. But in this book we're following our main character called Prudence. She is a high school student who is very much likes to do everything correctly. She likes to get good grades, she wants to be on time, she likes to do things a certain way. She ends up getting paired for this project with a boy called Quint, who is basically the exact opposite of her. He's known for like going to school really late and like not getting the best grades, and basically just the exact opposite of her, and he ends up arriving to school late the day that they are supposed to do this presentation project, and then later that night she slips and hits her head and finds herself supposedly having the ability to dish out instant karma to people. I didn't super love this book, which is very upsetting for me to say because I absolutely love Marissa Meyer, but this is definitely my least favorite of her books that I've read. I think the reason so many people really like Marissa Meyer, not just because of her writing, but more specifically because she writes such amazing characters. Like, if you've ever read the Lunar Chronicles, you know like how amazing the characters are that she writes and just how lovable they are. But in this book, our main character is so annoying that it just kind of ruined the whole experience for me. Like, I still think Marissa Meyer has great writing, like I enjoyed the writing of this book, but I just think her character really put a damper on the whole situation. And at the same time, I understand that like a lot of our main character's problems were so she could have like a character growth and a character arc, but was she any less annoying at the end of the book? Not really. So yeah, I just didn't super like this, and like I said, I went into it expecting like a contemporary romance, but I found that the real romantic parts of it didn't come until like the last quarter of the book, if less than that, and I didn't even find that our main characters particularly had a lot of chemistry, probably just because I found the main character so irritating, so I didn't want her to end up with the dude because he was actually decent and she was not, so that's that. I should say though, before we move on actually, that I did give this book 3.5 stars. So I didn't hate the book by any means, but just considering how much I love Marissa Meyer, it was like that much more of a disappointment, if you know what I mean. But it's still, I don't consider it to be like a bad book. The next book that I picked up in January was called My Story by Elizabeth Smart. I actually listened to the audiobook of this, which was narrated by Elizabeth. If you don't know who she is, she was abducted in the early 2000s. I think she was like 13 years old, and she was held captive for about 9 months before they finally found her, and this is basically her story. So this is a book that I didn't rate because it's just one of those things that you can't possibly rate it or review it by any means. So all I can say is that I definitely do recommend this book if you are interested in hearing this kind of story. Trigger warning for, again, sexual assault, rape, alcohol and drug abuse and basically anything under the sun that you would expect with the story. Like, just be aware before picking the book up. But if you do pick it up, I do actually really recommend the audiobook because it's read by Elizabeth, and I think stories are so much more powerful when you are actually hearing the person read it themselves. The next book that I picked up, I actually have to pull it up on my phone because it has 4 different authors. So it's called Hope, A Memoir of Survival in Cleveland. This is by Amanda Berry, Gina De Jesus, Mary Jordan, and Kevin Sullivan. So Amanda and Gina were 2 out of 3 girls that were abducted again in the early 2000s by a man called Ariel Castro, and they were held captive in his house for 10 years until one of them finally escaped, and this is their story. So Amanda and Gina are 2 of the girls, and then the other 2 authors in this book, I believe, were either journalists or maybe investigators who were looking into the case at the time that it was happening. So Amanda and Gina give accounts of what was happening inside the house, and the other 2 authors, Mary and Kevin, give a story of what was happening outside of the house at the time that all of this was going on. So once again, exact same trigger warnings for this book, and like, you can't rate it, I can't really review it. All I can say is that you should pick it up if you feel like you can handle this kind of story. And I also listened to the audiobook for this again. Even though it wasn't narrated by any of the authors, I did think that the narrators that read it did a really good job. There were 2 narrators for each of the girls, and then 1 for the accounts of what was happening outside of the house. But yeah, that's all I can really say about this book. And then finally, the last book that I read in January, I actually read the majority of it last year. I'd say I probably read the last 200 pages of this book, maybe the last half of this book in January, and that is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. I have finally finished this dang book, which is really embarrassing because I put it in my 10 favorite books of 2020 because I was so sure that I was going to finish it in 2020, and then I didn't. So now I'm embarrassed, but at least I finally got to it. And I've mentioned before on my channel that I just think Tolkien's writing is one that I have to read slowly in order to fully appreciate, like, the richness of his writing and the story and these characters and the world. Like, just think about it. Like, this is like one of the richest fantasy worlds that I know of, at least. I mean, I'm not super versed in fantasy, but I feel like this is one of, like, the greatest. So there's just so much richness to be appreciated, and that is easiest for me to do when I read it very slowly. So I'm not super upset with the fact that this book took me like almost 300 days to read, which I know that because in my new statistics thing, which comes from Allie over at Hardback Hoarder, I super appreciate that she makes these little statistic things every year for us to track our reading. But there is a start and end date that you could put in, and then it will calculate how many days it took you to read this book, and it was over 290 days, I think. So that's a little embarrassing, but yeah, like I said, I'm not ashamed of it because I super appreciated every, like, element of this book. I felt like I really read this book to its fullest, if you know what I mean. Obvious 5 out of 5 star read. I knew I was going to love this book because I'm such a big fan of the movies, and even though I know that the movies and the books are different, I still think that Peter Jackson actually did a good job with those movies. I know a lot of people would disagree, but I did learn quite a lot more about the world and the characters and everything, and maybe how, like, characters related to each other and different things about the different places. I did feel like I learned a lot more from reading this book. So I'm definitely looking forward to picking up The Two Towers sometime this year, and maybe finally finishing that book in 2022. Who's to say? So those are all of the books that I read in January. If you read any of these books, leave me a comment down below and let me know what you thought of them. I would love to discuss them with you in the comments. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!
You hear that, Samson?